Buenas tardes, estimadas y estimados amigos. Después de haber pasado 2 espléndidos días en que los peruanos hemos practicado nuestro inglés and our visiting guests have practiced their Spanish, y por tanto puedo hablar en inglés o en castellano porque igual me van a entender. Llegamos al final prácticamente de este coloquio, que es una mesa redonda. Lamentablemente Miguel Rodríguez Mondoñedo no pudo venir, y el objetivo de esta mesa redonda es hacer una suerte de balance de lo que se logró hasta ahora en el proyecto The Geography of Philosophy, qué cosa es lo que hemos logrado, qué cosa es lo que hemos alcanzado, what we achieved with it, qué obstáculos hemos tenido, qué limitaciones hemos tenido, qué cosas no volveríamos a hacer si tuviéramos que repetir el proyecto, cómo lo cambiaríamos, si tuviéramos que trabajar otros conceptos, qué cambios haríamos en la metodología o de repente en la extensión de las comunidades con las que hemos trabajado. Entonces, yo comenzaré planteando algunas ideas que de repente han generado cierto consenso, no necesariamente en el proyecto, sino en el coloquio, eventualmente que han aparecido en el libro también, ¿no? Yo creo que una idea principal que ha surgido en este coloquio, sobre todo a partir de los comentarios de Clark Barrett, de las respuestas de Clark, es que uno de los resultados importantes del coloquio ha sido el dar voz universal a pueblos y comunidades que no la tenían. Es decir, incluso dentro del Perú, la mayor parte de peruanos no sabían que existía la lengua urarina. Dentro del Perú, la mayor parte de peruanos no sabían que existe el Valle del Chambira. Y me puedo imaginar que algo parecido ha podido ocurrir en otros lugares. Entonces, lejos de ser, digamos así, una imposición del norte respecto de países del sur, por ponerlo de esa manera, este proyecto lo que ha hecho es lo contrario. Lo que ha hecho es visibilizar a comunidades, pueblos, lenguas que eran invisibles, que no eran conocidas, ni siquiera en sus propios países, ¿no? Y eso se ha logrado, bueno, con el libro del que estamos hablando, con las publicaciones que van a salir, con el libro que se va a publicar en inglés y en otras publicaciones en artículos especializados. Eso me parece particularmente importante. Otra cosa que quizá hemos desarrollado es la idea de que no hay solo una filosofía occidental, sino varias formas diferentes de hacer filosofía, o por lo menos hay preguntas, conceptos, intuiciones que podríamos llamar filosóficas y que las encontramos probablemente en todas las culturas, en cualquier lengua, ¿no? En el caso de las culturas ágrafas, no hemos tenido registro conceptual de esas reflexiones filosóficas, o si alguna vez hubo registro, se perdió, pero podemos encontrar de alguna manera esas ideas en los conceptos que se mantienen densificados en las lenguas vivas, como si fueran fósiles lingüísticos de prácticas sociales ancestrales, es decir, intuiciones filosóficas que se mantienen todavía en las lenguas que aún se hablan, como en el caso, por ejemplo, de Yachay, que ha concitado tanto interés y que tiene connotaciones en la línea de habituarse a algo, tener querencia en algún lugar, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, yo quisiera comenzar preguntándoles a los miembros de la mesa algunas interrogantes muy generales. ¿Qué cosas deberíamos no volver a hacer? ¿Qué cosas deberíamos repetir qué errores hemos detectado, qué logros hemos obtenido, qué obstáculos hemos encontrado, y si es que siéntanse libres los miembros de la mesa de abordar estas preguntas de la manera como quieran hacerlo, desde sus perspectivas, y podríamos tener de repente un par de rondas de comentarios y luego tendríamos preguntas del público. Did you understand what I said, generally speaking? Yeah. Would you like to start since you
Solo, sí. Una cosita, yo estoy de acuerdo con todo lo que dijiste, Pablo.
Sí.
La única cosa que creo que tenemos que ampliar un poco es la idea de que esos conceptos como Yachay que estamos estudiando son como una especie de fósiles. En un sentido, tal vez, pero todavía son vivos, ¿no? Sí. Entonces, y es lo igual en inglés. No soy experto en eso, pero supongo que cuando cambia la cultura, la tecnología, no sé si se ha cambiado mi concepción de conocimiento por el internet. Cuando yo nací no existía. ¿Es conocimiento? No sé, pero es posible que siempre se está cambiando, ¿no? Y creo que, como estábamos conversando en al almuerzo, creo que muchos no estaban aquí, pero estábamos conversando de las diferentes ideas de derechos y en comunidades indígenas que siempre están cambiando por la situación política, pero no quiere decir que no son ideas indígenas. ¿No? Pero ahora las comunidades indígenas pueden tener ideas sobre propiedad intelectual, por ejemplo, que no existían hace 50 años. Pero como hemos visto, por ejemplo, en el trabajo de Angela Riley y otros, la gente indígena tiene ideas muy diferentes del occidente, pero siempre están en estado de cambiar. Eso es, creo que no.
Sí. No, tienes toda la razón, Clark. Creo que voy a aclarar lo que quise decir con la expresión fósiles lingüísticos. Sin duda, las connotaciones que hemos discutido, que están presentes en el verbo yachay, siguen utilizándose hoy, pero en un sentido metafórico, claro, son fósiles lingüísticos en la medida en que nos permiten reconstruir visiones del mundo muy antiguas, sí, también, ¿no? También. Visiones del mundo que incorporan intuiciones filosóficas. Lo que además nos lleva a otro tema sobre el que hemos conversado largamente en el coloquio, que es la idea de que las lenguas influyen en la cognición de una manera relevante, no solo porque contienen estos conceptos que mantienen de manera condensada prácticas sociales, formas de vida, visiones del mundo, sino también porque es, en algún sentido por lo menos, mediante el lenguaje que articulamos nuestras ideas, ¿no? Es una discusión muy antigua en filosofía del lenguaje si hay pensamiento no lingüístico, prelingüístico, etcétera, pero por lo menos una importante masa de información es transmitida y articulada lingüísticamente, ¿no? Sí. Y bueno, quisiera añadir unas cuantas cosas más antes de dar la palabra a nuestros invitados. Otro punto respecto del cual me parece que hemos logrado un cierto consenso, no es porque sea importante alcanzar consensos, ¿no? No es un objetivo, pero es interesante notar si es que así ha ocurrido, es que es valioso tomar en cuenta las epistemologías no occidentales, es decir, los presupuestos epistemológicos de comunidades no occidentales, no solo para conocerlas más a ellas mismas, sino porque ese conocimiento enriquecería a la misma epistemología occidental. Es decir, es un asunto de ida y vuelta, ¿no? No es solo transmisión de conocimiento de las comunidades hacia la vida académica occidental. No es solo eso, es un diálogo entre estos dos interlocutores. De hecho, el último capítulo del libro, Epistemologías Andinas y Amazónicas, está conformado por un diálogo con miembros de comunidades amazónicas. Entonces, eso es una cosa importante para notar que la voz de ellos está presente en el libro y en el proyecto en general, ¿no? Bueno, otra cosa que me parece muy importante que se ha discutido es la necesidad de una mayor investigación interdisciplinaria en filosofía con ciencias naturales y ciencias sociales. Yo, por lo menos, soy un creyente, y eso lo saben mis alumnos, que la filosofía como una disciplina pura, una disciplina aislada, es una disciplina que no va a ser creativa y no va a ser innovadora en los próximos años. Y que la única manera en que pueda ser más creativa y más innovadora es entrando en diálogo con otras disciplinas relevantes. Hay otro punto que aprovecharé para mencionar, y es esta sensación que algunos tenemos de que la filosofía que nace en Grecia hace más o menos 2500 años, y particularmente en el caso de Platón, menos años, nace con un presupuesto universalista y un presupuesto etnocéntrico. Es decir, Platón creía que los problemas que él estaba abordando, los conceptos que él estaba estudiando, eran universales, ¿no? Y hay un presupuesto universalista ahí, pero también etnocéntrico, porque si lo vemos desde el punto de vista del siglo XXI, evidentemente no eran universales, eran una parte de una concepción, de una cosmovisión de determinada época en la historia del mundo griego, ¿no? Ahora, podría haber algo de universalidad ahí, eso lo hemos conversado también. Podría haber algo de universalidad en la medida en que podría haber conceptos universales que sean parte del desarrollo, de la evolución del cerebro humano, y podríamos estar hablando de conceptos innatos, por ejemplo. Hay muchos autores que creen que existen conceptos innatos. El concepto de conocimiento podría ser un concepto innato, podría ser un concepto básico, ¿no? Pero también podría tratarse de conceptos que, no siendo innatos y no siendo básicos, son conceptos que son producto de la necesidad de todas las comunidades de adaptarse al medio. Pero a lo que quería llegar es a que la filosofía occidental nace con esos dos presupuestos, universalista y etnocéntrico, y es discutible si se ha llegado a liberar de ellos o no. La gran pregunta que también yo formularía a los que quieran contestarla es: ¿qué significaría que la filosofía se liberara de esos presupuestos universalistas y etnocéntricos? El caso de la descolonización es un poco más claro, porque existen muchas formas de colonización. Existe colonización política, colonización económica, colonización ideológica, colonización epistémica, ¿no? Y aunque, por ejemplo, el Perú ya técnicamente no es una colonia de España, no es una colonia política, en cierto sentido muchos países son todavía colonia económica de otros países, ¿no? Y podríamos suponer que también hay un grado de colonización epistémica, que es uno de los temas centrales que trató Belli al inicio del coloquio ayer. Pero entonces la pregunta sería esta: ¿podemos descolonizarnos epistémicamente en el sentido en que ella ha señalado en la ciencia, en algunas ramas de la filosofía, pero en todas las ramas de la filosofía también? ¿Es posible una descolonización de la metafísica o de la lógica? ¿Es necesaria? ¿Es valiosa? ¿Es factible? Bueno, estas son entonces algunas de las ideas sobre las que me parece hemos logrado, no sé si cierto acuerdo, pero por lo menos hemos desarrollado algunas ideas en esa dirección. Y ahora sí le daría la palabra a quien quisiera comentar en la mesa primero sobre este balance que queremos hacer de lo logrado, lo por lograr y lo que podríamos lograr en una segunda edición de The Geography of Philosophy. Who would like to start?
Go first. Can you hear me? No. Is this working?
It works.
Yes, it is.
Great. Thanks so much, Pablo. I'd like to focus on this idea of if we were to follow up, what we can do better.
Yes.
So I said quite a few things yesterday, but it struck me, actually Clark's diagram was really helpful to me to see exactly what I've been thinking, and I've been putting it in my head in terms of not enough Global South setting the research agenda, but I like your blank arrow there. So, okay, indigenous knowledges are fixing the data, helping fix the data, but they're not setting the theoretical frameworks. And so I would love to think more with you and with the audience about how we could do better on that. So, I mean, one thing would be in terms of methodologies. So there's plenty of stuff, at least in New Zealand, and well, I guess you were saying some stuff as well in the US on indigenous methodologies, scientific methodologies that we could perhaps. I was going to say incorporate and immediately realized that that's going to be some more pillaging, but you know what I mean.
Right.
And obviously would have to involve a lot more indigenous researchers themselves, in trained indigenous researchers. And another thing that I was thinking was like what to, when Pablo, when you were speaking earlier about the Quechua evidentials, if you actually flipped things around, if the Quechua was studying the global north concepts of knowledge, American concepts of knowledge, let's say, how weird this would look, right? So if you have evidentials, how weird our concept of knowledge would look and how imprecise. So it doesn't have any degrees of confidence involved in it. It doesn't have any implication of responsibility. It doesn't have any of the things that a Quechua speaker would attach to knowledge concepts. Mm-hmm. And so that would be another way of trying to think from the other point of view. I don't know. So these are some suggestions.
Eduardo, Clark.
Just very quickly on what Veli said. So I was at a very nice panel on indigenous science at the American Anthropological Association last year, and one of the commentators said that, pointed out, an indigenous scientist himself, that a lot of the work that we need to do to fill in that arrow involves thinking about what the barriers are, which sometimes are not intentional. Like the things that make it hard, and to create, I think the metaphor that he used that I really liked was create doors in and doors out, right? So that people can leave if they don't like what's happening. But I mean, when I think about the barriers that they include, we've seen. Nobody here is trying to do this, but like when people ask questions about, I think there can be barriers that like, are these ideas formulated in a way that can enter into dialogue with philosophy? Because Western philosophy has all these criteria for what counts as a legitimate theory and so on, right? And those create barriers, and in order to make this happen, we have to say, well, we have to think about those standards of logic and what, I don't know what they are even, right? But that we have to rethink those to create a level playing field. Because one of the barriers is the fact that the people that are allowing entry into cognitive science and philosophy are all people who have been trained in a particular tradition, right? And then they're going to say, well, this doesn't pass the criteria for me to engage in dialogue with it. So a lot of the work needs to be done, on our side, I would say.
Good. So I want to, in a way, follow up a bit on what Veli was saying about the challenges that we've met, the obstacles that we've met, and what would have to be changed if we were to do a similar project again. Not that I plan to apply for a grant And I think one of the things I've learned, so the project was located at Pitt. It was the main home of the project, and I was managing with an assistant, Victoria, who was extremely helpful, the postdocs who were managing the project. And what I've learned is the importance of infrastructures and institutions. Having a structure that allows, and a process which is defined well in advance and not haphazard for defining the research question. So having a way to bring people together such that we have clear research question on which we agree. Defining then the studies we're going to be running, so an explicit process. Then having a data collection pipeline, a data management pipeline, and so on and so forth. And what we tried to do that, but it was much less organized and planned than it should have been with hindsight. And I think it does reflect in a way in the shortcomings in doing what both Clark and Veli have been pushing us or criticizing the project in a very nice way, I should say, for not doing, meaning paying due attention to the perspectives of the Global South and the US. If you read the original grant application, it's all about that. The original grant application is all about that, inspired by Who's Asking, a book by Doug Medin, who is actually very much using this kind of themes and question. And our goal was indeed to try to find a way to involve all the collaborators to design, to formulate the question, design the experiments. But because we didn't really have, so we thought about the goal, we didn't really think hard enough about the means. And by which I mean, we didn't set up a process by which other voices than ours could be usefully contributing to, or sufficiently contributing to the design. So raising the questions, the kind of tools we're going to use, and the type of studies we're going to learn. And I think for me, with hindsight, it's really not having thought enough about the means for reaching out our goals. What kind of structure, process we should have had in place such that some of our goals, I think, which are quite aligned with what we've been talking about at this workshop, where we were able to meet them. So if we were to do the project again, the first thing I would do is think much harder about thinking about processes, pipelines, and ways that we make sure that our goals can be met. So that's the first thing. A second thing is doing less to do more. I think we were incredibly ambitious in our project. 100 people, 12 countries, 17 languages, 3 concepts, and it's exciting. You could see it. Of course, we have to sell the project to a funder. So the more ambitious and grandiose it looks, the more likely you are to get a $3 million, which is good. But I think because it's so ambitious, if we had a smaller set of goals, we would have been able to have more follow-ups to our project, to slow down some of the steps, and maybe to be more critical, self-critical, not at the end of the project as we are now, when we are reflecting upon what we've done, but throughout the project, have stages where we say, okay, things are not going quite the way we were expecting them to go, maybe we should try to rethink a little bit. But because we had so much to do and really so little time at the end of the day, it's quite striking how quickly 3 years go. So it turned into 6 years, but even 6 years go quite quickly, really. We never really, we were aware of that. We talked about it, in the various projects, the topics that we were fully aware. But we never really took the time to, once we realized there were some issues, find means to really address them. And because we are trying to do really so much. So again, doing less to do more is something I think would be very important. And one thing I'd like to mention finally is it's very exciting type of work. I think interdisciplinary work with people people that you're going to be meeting all over the world, cultures that you haven't met, is one of the most exciting things you can actually do. So don't be too dispirited by, in a sense, the challenges that we've met, and I think anyone is going to meet. It is a wonderful type of project, despite its shortcomings. One thing I've learned is that my expectation turned out to be regularly false. I turned out to be very bad at having true hypotheses about the world. And you know, it is quite striking when you do empirical science and you know, you make predictions based on what you think might well be the case. You actually learn to be humble often because the world turned out to be very different from what you're expecting. In many ways, that's actually quite exciting to be told by the world that no, you're wrong. Once again, you're. And you know, for a philosopher, you know, I'm by training a philosopher, and the world really pushed back because I can make argument, and you know, except my colleagues, and I always find a way to respond to their responses. So, but when you do some interdisciplinary work, at some point you can't really do that. The world is pushing back against your ideas, and I think that's also something I've learned actually throughout this project.
Mm-hmm. That might be the problem with knowledge that's not Yachai.
Y me gustaría hacerte una pregunta, Edward. ¿Tú dirías que en el balance se ha encontrado más universalidad que diversidad o más diversidad que universalidad?
So that's one of the things that, so we haven't looked at all the data, we're sleeping on a mountain of data. I feel like a dragon, I've got gold under me and I need to exploit the gold. But so far it's surprising that we found more similarities than diversity in some of the results I've been looking at. You know, I've presented the work on wisdom, and I'm not claiming there is no diversity to be found. I'm claiming that we haven't found the diversity with the tools we had at our disposition. And we looked also a bit at knowledge ascription, the kind of things that epistemologists are interested in. And there too, we didn't find great variation. We find variation compared to what philosophers say. So philosophers are quite bad at describing lay practices, but we didn't find variation across languages or across cultures, at least for some of the studies we've done. We've looked at the linguistic phenomenon of activity, where when you say, I know that P, you are assuming that P is actually the case. So I know that there's a cat on the mat, I'm assuming there's a cat on the mat. Otherwise I would have said, I think there's a cat on the mat. And it wasn't clear whether this phenomenon was found all over the world. It turned out that for all the languages we've looked at, it's a fairly robust phenomenon, and so on and so forth. So we found quite a surprising amount of universality so far. But I've only looked, maybe I would say, a sixth of the data. So there's much more to be looked at in more careful. So I think it's a bit too early to be quite certain about how much diversity there is in our data at this point.
Yeah.
But what I've looked at, surprising amount of similarities across languages and cultures.
Y yo me pregunto si esa universalidad que se ha encontrado no depende también de la metodología. A lo largo de los 6 años del proyecto, yo he tenido una pregunta que me ha atormentado en las noches y me producía pesadillas, nightmares, ¿no? Que es la siguiente: cuando uno quiere reconstruir un concepto de una lengua distinta, por ejemplo, desde el castellano, quieres reconstruir, castellano es Spanish, Castilian, ¿no? Quieres reconstruir el concepto de conocimiento en una lengua que no tiene influencia del castellano, porque el quechua tiene 500 años de influencia del castellano, el shipibo por lo menos 300, el urarina no, el urarina tiene mínima influencia del castellano. Entonces, cuando tú quieres reconstruir, por ejemplo, el concepto equivalente a conocimiento en urarina, o el concepto equivalente a verdad en urarina, o justificación, de alguna manera estás proyectando tus propios conceptos en esa lengua, y entonces vas a encontrar lo que de alguna manera estás buscando, porque estás rastreando eso que tu esquema conceptual necesita capturar. No sé si me dejo entender, ¿no? Ahora, lo que no veo es una manera de resolver ese problema. Como hemos conversado ayer, ese es el viejo problema de radical interpretation, ¿no? Y no hay una manera clara de resolver ese problema en lenguas tan alejadas de las lenguas occidentales. ¿Cómo ves eso, Edward?
Clark might want to answer.
You are the anthropologist.
I think one way, it's not, so it is a common question, but maybe one way to answer the question is not to really answer it, but to look at a similar issue in another domain, where you look at another species and you find patterns of behavior that are, of course, similar and different from patterns of behavior that you might be observing in human beings, courtship, for example, or in other species, right? So what you're really doing here is observing some phenomenon and looking at similarities and differences. Now, what are the relevant dimensions is always, of course, the tricky question, right? Similarities and differences are cheap in themselves. But you might be able to identify what you think from a theoretical point of view as a relevant dimension to assess similarities and differences. And that might allow you to carve, when you look, for example, in ethology, as, oh, it's a phenomenon of courtship. It's a phenomenon, or it's an instance of whatever type of behavior. And I think that you want to say the same thing when it comes to recognizing a concept in a different language. It's very similar to radical interpretations, that's right.
Yes.
So you see a pattern of behavior, a word that is used to draw conclusion, to make inferences, that's used in certain contexts and not others, that's withdrawn in certain circumstances and not others. And of course, it's not going to be used like the word knowledge or to know that in English, but there will be overlap. And it might have the same function, so you might try to identify what's the point of having that concept in a given language. So for example, on my view, the point of the concept of knowledge is to draw a distinction with thinking. And I think that's really why we have the concept of knowledge, is actually to be able to draw that contrast between having a thought but not being quite so certain about it, while having a thought and actually being extremely certain, assuming that it is the case. Right? So there's a function, and when I can see across languages similarities between that, I think we're entitled, at least as a maybe indefeasible manner, to assume that we have found a match. And I think it's quite similar to what you do in ethology. I don't think it is really deeply different from what you do when you identify a behavior as courtship among ducks compared to human beings. So it's quite similar to radical interpretation. I think you're entirely right. It's exactly the same phenomenon. Sometimes it's easier because of the deep connection. You mentioned Castilian and Quechua easier because of the exchanges. Sometimes it's much harder. I don't know. Clark, you have some thought about that? Yeah, I guess you must, as an anthropologist, you must have thought much more than I have about it.
I'm not so sure, but I also wanted to mention, in addition to the idea of the language and the words we're using, that what Veli was raising in her talk about the situation, various things that you raised, right? That in the wisdom thing, we were giving situations that didn't include situations that would be the sort of prototypes of how you would ask, or how you would seek wisdom, right? And that's not necessarily about the words you use, and other things like that. The one other thing that I thought when you used the factivity study is, it was mentioned in the earlier panel. I asked the question like, well, if everyone knows that embodied non-propositional knowledge is an important part of our knowledge and maybe the most common kind of knowledge, why has philosophy been so obsessed with knowing that P for so long? And I think that you said that, and Cesar might have raised this as well, that it's because of a need to look at knowledge in the context of whether it's true or not, right? Kind of an obsession with truth. And so knowing that P, in some sense, is the only kind of, or at least the prototype of knowledge that you evaluate in terms of truth conditions.
That's right.
Right? And so it might not be a coincidence that when we do a study about knowing that P, you get factivity judgments across all these languages, but it's ignoring the fact that that may be a minority of the kind of knowledge that people are thinking about, right? So it's something you get about factivity statements, right? But it doesn't say most knowledge is like this in these places, or that factivity is the basis for judging knowledge everywhere.
Yeah.
Maybe that's too much.
Yes and no. I mean, thinking that P also comes with a that clause, and it's not factive, right? And you might also think that knowing how has a form of activity attached to it. So it's not in terms of truth, it's in terms of success. I know how to bike. Well, I don't really know how to bike if I can't bike.
Sure.
I know how to cook. I know how to cook an osobuco. If I can't make an osobuco, I don't know how to cook an osobuco.
Yeah.
So you might think that knowing how to, which is more of an embodied form of knowledge, also come with an assumption of success. Except the nature of the success is not in terms of truth, in terms of reaching goals. And we haven't looked at that actually.
That would be a good thing to look at.
But exactly, that's one of the places where, coming from the West, and being a philosopher, misled a little bit the kind of project we could have done. I suppose someone coming from another language or another background might have let's think about knowing how. It's much more interesting and much more important as a form of knowledge. Let's see how it's understood across languages, across settings.
Yeah.
And the answer is that we don't know, because we just haven't done it. And we haven't done it because I'm a philosopher, and because there's so much written on knowing that as the main focus. So you're right. I mean, I think that's exactly the point you're drawing, right? It's just, it's interesting.
But let me give you a couple of examples of what I was worried about. In Quechua, there is no word for believe. There is no verb to believe. The word they use when they want to say John believes that P is John says that P. The verb would be niji, which literally means to say yes. No? There's an important reason that explains why Quechua doesn't have a word for belief. It is this. When you make a statement, you need to use an evidential. But if you want to say that John believes that P, what evidential are you going to use? Because you don't know whether he really believes that, or somebody told you he believes that, or it's just a conjecture. So the point is, in ancient Quechua, before the arrival of the Spaniards, there was no verb to describe a belief. When the Spanish came, of course, there was very important to use a word to believe, because they wanted to make them believe something. No? And the word nij, which literally means to say, acquired a connotation of belief, but only in religious topics, and particularly in Christian areas and dimensions. No? That's one thing. And the other thing is justification. I went to Professor...
Can I say something?
Of course, yes.
I mean, it's really not about Quechua. Believing that is actually a very rare term. In most languages of the world, there is no translation of believing that. It's actually a very unusual term. What there is a contrast between knowing and either thinking, or knowing and saying, just like in Quechua. So in fact, here the outlier is not Quechua. The outlier is English and Western languages. And you're right about all the religious connotation of believing. I mean, croyance, croire in French, is a religious attitude, right? What you would do is you would say rather think that, penser que. If you say croire, it has a religious connotation. So my inclination here is that the US, it's English that's the outlier here, not so much Quechua. There's a beautiful book called The Invention of Belief. It's a history of linguistics in the 16th century in Europe. How this concept started to emerge.
Yeah.
So anyway.
That's really interesting. And the other concept that worried me was justification. Because if you want to see if in Quechua you have this concept of X knows that P if and only if X believes that P is true, and X has good justifications to believe that P. I went to Professor Cerrón Palomino, who you met, an extremely good Quechuist, and I asked him, how do you say justification in Quechua? Well, he gave me a word, and then he said, but look, it doesn't really mean justification. This word means something like to value something, give the value, in the same sense that you can find justification in English or justificación in Spanish. Justification means to find the just value or the just weight of something. That's the etymology, at least. And in Spanish happens the same thing. You know? But in Quechua, the word means literally to give value to something. And when I asked Professor Cerrón Palomino, yes, but I don't want to know that. I want to know what happens if I ask somebody something, he gives me an answer, and then I ask him, please give me your reasons to believe that. What is the verb you would use? He thought about 5 minutes and he said, I think people would use the word justificación. No?
In Spanish?
In Spanish, yes, of course. Quechua has lots of words coming from Spanish. So this is in the lines of how we had to use our own languages, in this case Western languages, to make sense of the evidence we were trying to capture, right?
Would they not have words for evidence and reasons?
Probably yes. Víctor, ¿tú sabes cuál sería la palabra quechua para dar razón de algo o evidencia? Sí, pero eso significa valorar, ¿no es cierto? Razonar. Razonar. But razonar would mean something like to reason, to think. No dar una razón de algo, dar una justificación de algo. ¿No?
A word in French for evidence. There's no word in French for evidence.
There is no word in French for evidence?
You guys just make up stuff all the time?
No, but there's no
That
word.
explains many things.
There's no mass term that can
Really?
Yeah, of course not. There's definitely, évident means obvious.
No, but
Evidence means it's the fact that something is obvious.
No, but with the C. Evidence.
Yeah.
But can I maybe suggest
Please,
something forward?
yes.
Because, and it started with you saying something about the function, what you take the function of know to be. And I'm thinking of people like Edward Craig and other functionist analyses who start with, okay, let's look at what this word is doing in this language and then analyze it in those terms. So, knowledge is going to be this for him, what allows me to identify a good informant. And so if you work with that idea, then maybe we'll find a lot more words for, belief,
Yeah.
knowledge, instead of trying to do these one-on-one translations.
Yeah. And I also wanted to ask Clark something. Clark, you've been working with philosophers for many years.
Yeah.
How was that a strange experience? Because by default, many philosophers, not necessarily those who are here, but by default, many philosophers are universalists.
Yeah.
And by default, anthropologists are not, are at least methodologically relativists.
Yeah.
So did you find weird, in the non-weird sense, to work with this species of academics that tend to find universals everywhere?
I mean, I think, yeah, but yes. Also, the way that questions are asked and I mean, Gord mentioned that, and I'm not sure we have a record of this, but we should. The number of methods that I rejected, I desk rejected several studies because they were. probably, this is not fair, but I think, the example of something that an experimental philosopher would ask is, okay, everyone, imagine a fully deterministic universe. Now, John goes to the store and buys a hamburger. Did John choose to buy a hamburger, right? That's considered a study in experimental philosophy, right? And
some of the classic studies exactly this one. I mean, Navias in Code 2005,
Yeah, and so that's one example of something where it's not illegitimate completely, but it's like, my immediate response is, I don't even know what the data would mean of what people would say, so I think, and it's maybe a variety of the kind of thing that Veli was pointing to of, if you don't give people the right choices or frame it the right way, or whatever right is maybe not the right word, but you can heavily determine what you're going to find out by how you ask it and what you ask. And so that's a case of the kind of, I can't remember what language we were using, but like extreme or like bizarre situation where, and so I had to urge like, no, we need ordinary situations, right? If we're interested in moral judgment, we want to ask everyday cases where people have lots of experience, right? And I do think that that resonates with this idea of like, where you're going to have the richest possibility to see ideas is things where people have a lot of experience with them. Because if you're asking people who are amateurs or whatever the word would be, novices in some domain, how are you going to interpret? I think there's a thing with that situation where it's like, I can't even really imagine the situation. I can't do what you're asking me to do, right? That's required for the thought experiment to work. Then, so there's that, and then there's many other things about kind of just sort of disagree, different approaches to what. There's many things that philosophers take to be real that I just.
Like what, for instance?
Like free will.
No, that's not one. It's just let's put it this way. There's different ideas about what we mean. If you say justice, right? I don't think that justice is, doesn't exist, but my ontology of what that would be is perhaps quite different than what a lot of philosophers would think. So you're starting from very different, points of view.
But that's exactly what I meant, that many philosophers probably believe that there is something called justice that you want to grasp,
right.
that you want to understand.
Right.
And you would say, well, there is no such a thing as justice.
That's right.
There is the concept of justice in these people, or in this group of people, or in this group of people. But how does it affect the philosophical project?
Yeah.
That the philosophical project is not to describe how the Urarinas understand justice.
Right.
Is to describe what is justice.
That's right. That's one aspect, is that the philosophers that I know, some of them anyway, would start by assuming there is a thing, and it's out there, and we need to detect it, or we need to find out, and then we need to describe. But other kinds of examples that have been discussed more directly, even in the work that I was citing, like the Aztec philosophy book. This person is saying the distinction between natural and supernatural. Many anthropologists have said this, and many people from indigenous communities are like, no, we don't make a distinction between what's natural and supernatural. It's all natural, right? And so, everything is part of nature, right? And so, if you go into, but many times I've heard talks, including by anthropologists, not just philosophers, where they're talking about the category of supernatural beliefs, as if that is a thing. And I know, because I was raised in the same culture, I think I have a sense of what that's supposed to refer to. But to assume from the get-go that there's such a thing as supernatural ideas is already assuming something exists that might not exist, right? And this is a classic thing in anthropology. Do you mean from the point of view of the observer? Do you mean from the point of view of the person himself?
Yeah.
And usually in that case, what you mean is that to the anthropologist, these appear to be supernatural because they're positing beings that the anthropologist or the philosopher says don't exist, right? But anyway, that's just one category. I mean, the other one that people like Stitch have talked about is the category of the moral, where, you know, is it really a delineable thing? If you go in and say there's such a thing as a moral judgment and there's other judgments, there's some actions that are moral actions and there's some actions that are not moral actions. Philosophers, seems like many of them want to have that distinction a priori, and then they leave open as an empirical matter, like what's the boundary? That's okay. But if there is no such thing, then you could get in trouble with your methods.
But in regards to your first point, justice, many philosophers would say that they are not describing any concept of justice, nor justice itself. They are just telling you what they think, the way they think that the word justice should be used. For instance, if you talk to John Rawls, he will say, look, I am not describing anything. I'm not describing a Platonic idea of justice. I am telling you how I think that the word justice should be used in order to be more explanatory.
I see.
So it would be like a normative project more than a descriptive project.
Right.
But there's an important difference too with anthropologists, because anthropologists describe. Philosophers sometimes do not describe. They want to posit definitions or whatever.
Right.
No?
Good point. Yeah, that's a distinction as well.
So stay in your area.
Okay. I'll let the binary distinctions rise.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
I just wanted to say that one of the many joys of this project has actually been to like have my ideas about what philosophy is and all these quirky things that we do kind of revolutionized and questioned. So for you, the world pushed back. For me, like other disciplines pushed back in this project. So it was really wonderful to work with people like Clark, and I had a sociologist as a postdoc, and to learn how amazing these disciplines are and how unbound by empirical constraints we are, and how much more bound we should be by empirical constraints in philosophy. And I learned that from the project. That was one of your questions at the beginning.
Yes. Well, I have another question for you too, Dan. You come from a country that is extremely diverse, South Africa, and you have always had a very fine sensitivity to interculturality. To what extent working in this project has changed your views about interculturality, or it doesn't have changed at all?
I'm not sure that it has, because it hasn't. It's not as though like somehow the learning that the differences in these concepts would change my views of. I mean, so I'm immersed in these cultures, and so I have far less theoretical recourse to them. And so in some ways, like, I don't know, I'm not sure how, so maybe you tell me how, give me an example of what you think should have happened, or?
Okay, what I meant is this. You always had sensitivity for intercultural issues, but now you have worked professionally in it. You have become much more aware of it, probably, I don't know.
I mean, remember that I teach students every day, right? So that, from these various cultures, and so I have other recourse to these cultures. So it's not like, it's a bit different for you guys, like going into the Amazon or whatever. So you're not interacting every day.
Okay.
I mean, it's had some surprises in terms of like, so people like from this culture find marriage really important, and that makes sense. So from that point of view, I don't think anything has like dramatically changed. So it hasn't been like, I really thought that the Zulus were this, but now I think that they're this because they think some sort of wisdom. Yeah,
I understand, and I think the same happens with Clark, because he's an anthropologist. What about Edward? The same question.
How about cultural sensitivity? It's difficult to say. I'm a Westerner. Even so, I'm an immigrant in the US. I'm still a Westerner. I don't know. I mean, it has confirmed, I suspect, my sense of how fascinating human diversity is. But I didn't really need much confirmation about that. It's been like for the last 20 years. It's been one of the things I've been trying to investigate in some way or other. Is the extent and nature and explanation of human diversity. So this project, in a sense, didn't quite change my views on the matter. Just, as I said at the beginning, it revealed to me how much harder it is to get an understanding of it, both at the level of description and to say nothing at the level of explanation, than I might have thought at the beginning. I think that's probably, for me, the main lesson is it is really quite hard to get a sense of diversity and to say nothing of explaining it. There's all these methodological challenges, the limitations that you're always meeting. So in that respect, it doesn't change my fundamental interest, doesn't change my fascination, doesn't change my sense. It's very important from a philosophical point of view to get a handle on this diversity. It has shaken a little bit my conviction that I know a whole lot about diversity. Now I'm actually quite uncertain actually about how much diversity there is, to what respect, in which extent, and I feel it's very hard to do, despite all the enormous amount of time we spend on that project. It's actually really, really difficult. I mean, won't surprise a proper professional like Clark, but as a tourist amateur, I suppose, it's humbling actually how difficult the task really is to describe and understand diversity, human diversity.
Yes.
And it's so easy to be misled. I mean, I think Clark said it earlier in his talk, or maybe it was earlier. It's so easy to be misled by results either of universality or diversity that are just byproduct of the methods you're using, that are just not genuinely representative of human diversity, or you haven't thought of the right tools. And all of that is just always in your way of getting a proper understanding. I think that's really what, for me, what I've really gotten out of this project is how difficult these things are. I think it's really worth knowing somehow that you know much less than you thought you know. That is when you knew is actually a wonderful lesson. I know nothing. That's how philosophy got started in Athens. So it's a very philosophical lesson at the end of the day.
Yes. Quizá podríamos tener algunas preguntas del público. Siéntanse libres de hacer preguntas filosóficas o incluso preguntas personales, preguntas no sobre la vida personal de nadie, sino sobre cómo cada quien se ha sentido trabajando en el proyecto, la perplejidad que le ha producido o lo que fuese. Así que, sí.
Hay un...
¿Quién tiene el micro? Podrías, si quieres, comenzar haciendo tu pregunta mientras traen el micro.
Y también aquí.
Y ahí. Ya leí el micro.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to speak in English because my question is, I'm going to pose it to all members on the table, and I want to make sure that it's well understood. I would like to raise a challenge, perhaps, or point to some difficulty that comes with the nature of the work that you are carrying. It was mentioned in a previous presentation, I don't remember if it was today or yesterday, that the philosophy, when we speak of Western philosophy, we often speak of the philosophy of the philosophers, professional philosophers, people who are specialized in thinking, basically. But that is distinct from the philosophy of everyday Western citizens. And although they are both related in some way, we usually think of Western philosophy as the philosophy of the specialists. Just as we speak of, for example, Italian art, not as the art or the paintings of the everyday Italians, but of the Italian painters, those who are specialized in that. And it makes sense because Western societies are often composed of big populations. There's a great division of labor. Some people specialize in some things, and they become, we can say, more representative of what that society, or Western society, can offer. But this points to certain asymmetry that is difficult to overcome in the work you're doing, because not all the indigenous societies you're going to come in contact with have the same division of labor. There's not necessarily a group of people whose everyday job make a living as philosophers, academics, like that. So it's kind of strange. I could imagine a world in where, for example, a Chinese philosopher, academic, would go to a European country and start asking questions of everyday people. And yes, he could say that that's Western philosophy, but that's not the same thing as the philosophy of the philosophers of the West. So there is an asymmetry that is difficult to overcome. And it's not always going to be the case that we will find a small group, part of the indigenous community, for example, whose everyday activities is to think, to do research. So what we can find is, it makes me doubt how representative is of what the culture could offer if, for example, things had transpired, if history had gone in another direction. But we could ask ourselves, what would have happened if Spanish colonialism had not occurred and the Inca Empire had lasted another 500 years? They would probably have a specialized class of philosophers, academics that make a living just thinking, and the dialogue would be of a different nature. That's a challenge. A possible solution, perhaps, well, not exactly a solution, but something that would give ideas, is to take the example of what happened, or what happens in, for example, China. China has a history, a long, well-documented history. Chinese philosophy and science is very well documented. And at least up to the 16th century, it pretty much grew with independence from the West. After that there's some mixture, but that is an example of a society that shares some similarities with the West, in the sense that it's a big population, there's a great division of labor, there are thinkers. Chinese were famous for their encyclopedias, printing, etc. And so Chinese philosophy has this academic version that is an extension, we could say, of the everyday philosophy of everyday Chinese citizens. Perhaps there could be a comparative work that could give some ideas about how to explore the relation that can be between the academic philosophy of a given society and the everyday philosophy of everyday members of the same society. This is something I've been thinking about. I don't know what your ideas are concerning this matter.
Philosopher should answer.
Okay, I'm happy to say a couple of things. So the first one is that indeed there is a good project here that would be comparing across settings where there is a distinct discipline of philosophy. You mentioned China, but of course Japan is in the same situation, mostly through its connection to China. India, of course, has a very long history of philosophy, hundreds of years, millenaries, really, and try to compare to the more academic, so to speak, or institutionalized activities that we call philosophy in these settings with lay concept in those settings, and see whether there's an interesting connection, whether somehow some important themes, maybe in Indian philosophy. I'm a bit reluctant to talk about Indian philosophy and Western philosophy and myself, because I think there's tremendous diversity in all these traditions, but bracketing that concern, that would be an interesting project. I agree about that. No one has done that. It would require great expertise first in Indian philosophy and then being able to examine some of these relevant philosophical concepts among Indians. It would be probably a worthwhile project. Another project which already exists is comparing Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Western philosophy, and other already institutionalized forms of philosophy. There's comparative philosophy, it's a thriving discipline. It's got in many departments in the USA and elsewhere, in Asia as well, in India. You have people whose job is to describe and compare various forms of academic philosophy. Now, this is not what we did, indeed, but I think the asymmetry you're seeing in our project isn't really quite there. It's not there because we're not really comparing Plato, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, David Lewis with the people in, I don't know, Morocco, for example, uneducated or even educated people, but without education in philosophy. We're comparing lay people in the US when they use a philosophical concept to lay people in Morocco, to lay people in India. So there's no real asymmetry there. And the assumption is the one you're pointing out, however, is that there's some really interesting connection between lay concepts and philosophical concepts. It's complicated, I assume, but there are themes in philosophy that are deeply rooted in some of the ways a given culture understands a given concept. So I don't think there's much of an asymmetry. In fact, we're doing the proper comparison. But there are other projects, like the one you've actually been usefully mentioning, which would be really worth doing, but would require a level of expertise that I don't have. In a workshop, I don't know whether Clark remember, in Pittsburgh, one of the things we wanted to do is actually work with comparative philosophers, which was in 2015, 2016, before the Geography of Philosophy project, when we were trying to think about the project. And so we had invited Indian philosophers, so philosophers working on Indian philosophy, Americans, to come talk to us because we wanted to have their input to our project. We found great hostility in what we were planning to do and very little interest among them. They just thought the right philosophy was what academic philosophers in India were doing, was a great text written by Indian philosophers. And asking what lay non-philosophers in India thought about free will was very much of a waste of time, and they wanted to have nothing to do with us. So it was very clear at the end of this workshop that we were not going to be collaborating in any project. Maybe we were unlucky with the people I don't know whether Clark remember, but it was someone from Texas, no name would be given. A very famous scholar of Indian philosophy. And we clearly got a sense that he had lost his weekend. We were never he was going. So you would need to find the right people who are not only interested into the great traditions, but also who think it's worthwhile to see how they're rooted in everyday thinking. And I do think often it is. It's just a matter of doing it the right way, and I think it's a great project, but we haven't done it. Maybe you can do it. So, it's a really wonderful project, I think. Maybe you want to add something?
No, I'm good.
Yeah. Okay.
Clark, would you say something? No?
Yeah.
You should say something. Don't you have thoughts on this question?
Yeah, Pablo.
Later on.
Okay.
Usted tenía una pregunta.
Bueno, una pregunta y un comentario en realidad. Esto es un Novo Ordum Seclorum, Pachacútec, cambio de tiempos. Lo que ustedes han hecho es muy inspirador durante las 2 sesiones, los 2 días. Y es alentador para hacer algo, ¿no? Manos a la obra. Y estaba pensando si esto que es epistemología andina y amazónica no puede ser motivo para un encuentro, I quote with sponsors, de los pueblos originarios de todo el continente, en un lugar que podría ser acá, porque ellos tienen una ligazón ancestral en lo que se llama la madre tierra, el respeto a la naturaleza. Acá le decimos Pachamama, y ahí tiene otros nombres según otras culturas, pero arriba también en el norte. Ahí también tenían una madre tierra, cuyo nombre en este momento no recuerdo, y tenían una lengua franca, que era el Delaware, ¿cierto? Y tenían a un dios más o menos común, Manitou. Y entonces, a través de ese enlace, se puede recolectar a manera de los ilustrados filósofos, antropólogos, las proximidades en la elaboración epistémica que ellos pudieran tener. Un momento como cronistas podían tomar nota y después en sus lugares de origen recuperar eso que se ha encontrado y posibilitado en esos encuentros. Supongo que eso podría ser interesante porque también daría oportunidad a que se mencione pues que el quechua tiene dos formas de nosotros y la gran mayoría de idiomas del mundo solamente tiene un nosotros y nosotros tenemos dos nosotros, el que incluye al interlocutor y el que lo excluye. Y nuestro pacha pues es un término increíblemente potente que desde el punto de vista de un físico es espacio-tiempo y no lo puedo separar. Entonces cualquier cosa tengo que entenderla de esa manera y de repente hay otros idiomas que tienen lo mismo, pero desde una perspectiva occidental obviamente eso no se va a entender, pero se va a sentir y después se puede devolver para tener una reflexión epistemológica que ya abandona el supremacismo del enfoque occidental. ¿No es cierto? Más o menos sí. Por ahí era lo que quería comentar y de repente verla en esa pregunta que estoy soslayando es si se puede hacer eso, qué se podría hacer y quiénes serían los actores para eso. Principalmente ellos, ¿no?
Sí.
Gracias.
¿Qué piensa Pablo?
Bueno, sí, es una idea interesante. Ahora, los indígenas de América tienen muchas redes que los integran, ¿no? Existen redes que tienen el nombre de Amerindia, hay una red de amazónicos que tiene el nombre de Sagrada Amazonía, en fin, hay muchísimas redes de integración, entre ellos están muy conectados, ¿no? Si nosotros participáramos en un encuentro de ese tipo, seríamos como los extraños investigándolos y hasta podría ellos interpretarlo mal, pero porque el proyecto de The Geography of Philosophy es un proyecto científico, en realidad, es un proyecto filosófico, ¿no? El objetivo no es solo generar un encuentro entre personas de distintas comunidades, sino extraer información que tenga validez científica para entender la cognición humana. O sea, ese es el objetivo en última instancia, ¿no? Pero yo creo que la palabra que sacaría de la conversación es supremacismo, porque en su pregunta, quizá no le entendí bien, pero estaba implícita la idea de que un proyecto como el proyecto de The Geography of Philosophy podría tener ese aire paternalista que alguien mencionó en una ocasión anterior, o un aire supremacista que también, me alegro me alegro estar de acuerdo con usted entonces en eso de que no hay ese elemento, ¿no? Pero quería subrayar en todo caso la idea de que el proyecto de The Geography of Philosophy tiene una pretensión académica que va más allá de simplemente describir prácticas sociales, ¿no? Tiene que ver con tratar de entender procesos cognitivos humanos desde el punto de vista de la antropología cognitiva que cultiva, por ejemplo, Clark Barrett, y a partir de una serie de experimentos y de test que han sido cuidadosamente estudiados, ¿no?
Yo me refería al ambiente hostil que promueve ese supremacismo, porque nosotros tenemos educación en donde se ha soslayado el aporte originario, ¿no? Se ha prohibido, incluso hay épocas en que se ha prohibido el hablar idiomas acá, idiomas originarios, se despreciaba a la gente por eso. Hay racismo. Ese es el ambiente supremacista al que me refiero. El de su proyecto, no estoy insinuando eso. Lo que quiero ver es que en ese contexto hostil es que uno se desarrolla y estamos tratando de hacer esta, como diríamos, elevación de la dignidad reconocida, ¿no? que ellos tienen, por derecho, y además porque tienen muchos miles de años antes que nosotros.
De acuerdo. ¿Algún otro comentario, alguna otra pregunta? Uy, Jorge, ya, contrólate, Jorge.
No, disculpa, lo que pasa es que lo del paternalismo fue algo que surgió así nomás, pero lo que yo intentaba decir es que este proyecto se inscribe dentro de una lógica capitalista, naturalmente. Eso es lo que
¿Una lógica qué, perdón?
Una lógica capitalista, por supuesto.
Capitalista.
Claro, o sea, eso es lo que intentaba decir, ¿no? Pero ahora tengo otras que no es nada de malo, no tiene nada de malo, hermano. Pero que sí es una totalización, es una parte de la globalización, es un paso más en el proceso globalizador, ¿no? Yo te quería hacer una pregunta, Pablo, acerca de lo que dijiste sobre el quechua y el español, ¿no? Dijiste que no había una palabra en quechua para hablar de creencia. Entonces, sí. ¿Cómo se vería esto desde la perspectiva de la teoría del coherentista de la verdad, por ejemplo, ¿no? Porque, pues, a mí eso lo que me indica de algún modo es que, pues, en el lenguaje quechua no tiene los instrumentos, ¿no?, para poder desarrollar justamente proposiciones científicas, propiamente, ¿no? Entonces, esto yo lo conecto un poco con los resultados que tiene este proyecto para la filosofía y para la ciencia, ¿no? Porque de algún modo creo que los resultados son que no todos los pueblos tienen ni ciencias ni filosofía, ¿no? En el sentido, pues, de que una ciencia, pues, consiste en campos científicos que consta de términos, que son los objetos, consta de proposiciones científicas y que se cierran una vez que logran unas identidades como pueden ser, por ejemplo, las leyes ponderables de la química, ¿no?, que a través del desarrollo histórico de la ciencia se va cerrando en un campo científico, ¿no? Entonces, digamos que en lo que es los pueblos andinos no han tenido el desarrollo histórico para poder cerrar estos campos científicos, ¿no? Por ahí va, creo yo que estos son los resultados, ¿no? Que no todos los pueblos tienen filosofía y no todos los pueblos tienen campos científicos, pese a que puedan tener muchos conocimientos técnicos y muchos conocimientos avanzados, ¿no?, y hasta especializados, ¿no? Y otra pregunta que quería hacer es acerca de la interdisciplinariedad del proyecto, porque, pues, acá pues han trabajado varias disciplinas, ¿no? Pero, digamos, esta idea de interdisciplinariedad coloca de algún modo en un mismo estatuto a todas las disciplinas que están involucradas, ¿no? Bueno, el nombre ya tiene, pues, como que está más volcado a lo que es filosofía, ¿no? Pero, por ejemplo, en el caso del estatuto nociológico de la antropología, no es el mismo estatuto nociológico de la física, en el sentido de que la antropología no tiene, pese a que haga análisis factorial o análisis multivarianza, como se ha hecho en este caso, no logra sintetizar, no logra encontrar objetos que sean tan concretos como el caso de la física, ¿no? En ese sentido, pues no tiene, pues, la misma cientificidad que puede tener la física o la química, por ejemplo, ¿no? Y ahí hay un problema, ¿no? Entonces, en realidad, pues, yo quisiera saber cuál es digamos, la jerarquía del proyecto en relación a la filosofía. ¿Es la filosofía la que tiene más jerarquía en este proyecto o no? ¿No? Pues porque supone que la filosofía, una de las funciones de la filosofía es clasificar y organizar el conocimiento, ¿no?, y las conexiones que hay entre las distintas ciencias, ¿no?, a nivel categorial, ¿no? Por último, la ultimita es, ustedes han hablado de los consensos, quisiera saber más o menos cuáles han sido los desacuerdos que han tenido entre ustedes en este proyecto.
Bueno, veo que a pesar de mi pedido no te has controlado. Pero, bueno, voy a responderte. Lo primero es que no creo que este proyecto esté comprometido con una lógica capitalista. Lo que pasa es que el planeta Tierra... Sí, pero en el mismo sentido en que tú y yo estamos inmersos en una lógica capitalista y en el mismo sentido en que el bodeguero de la esquina de mi casa está inmerso en una lógica capitalista, no que este proyecto en particular esté más comprometido en una lógica capitalista, ¿no? Ese es un primer punto. Lo segundo es que cuando dije que el quechua no tiene palabra para creencia, de ahí no se deduce que no tenga un concepto de creencia, porque hay conceptos que no están lexicalizados. Lo que pasa es que ese concepto de repente es expresado, es lexicalizado mediante un verbo de expresión verbal, ¿no? Decir. Entonces, no tengo dudas de que un quechua hablante puede diferenciar entre una descripción del mundo confiable y una descripción del mundo que es menos confiable. Algo que en castellano llamaríamos una creencia verdadera o una creencia falsa. Lo que pasa es que ellos no tendrían una palabra para eso, pero eso no significa que no tengan el concepto para eso, ¿no? Por otra parte, no es una consecuencia, no es una conclusión en absoluto de este proyecto que no todas las comunidades tienen ciencia o filosofía. El proyecto no ha tratado sobre ese tema, ¿no? Más bien, en todo caso, quizá una de las conclusiones sería que todos los pueblos tienen intuiciones que nosotros utilizando una palabra griega, llamamos intuiciones filosóficas, pero que son intuiciones acerca de cuándo una representación es correcta, qué diferencia la apariencia de la realidad, cuándo una persona actúa de manera que los demás de su comunidad dirían que es una persona sabia, etcétera, ¿no? Exactamente, son intuiciones filosóficas, ¿no? Es decir, son intuiciones que nosotros le ponemos un nombre. Ese nombre lo hemos extraído de la tradición griega y lo llamamos filosófico, ¿no? Ahora, en relación a tu último punto, no me parece que haya una jerarquía de disciplinas en absoluto, y más bien tu concepción de la antropología me parece que presupone una visión más o menos positivista de las ciencias, ¿no? Según la cual las disciplinas que más se acercan a la física son más científicas. ¿Por qué? Porque son más nomológicas o son más matematizables, y las disciplinas que no se acercan a la física son menos científicas. Pero yo no conozco muchos filósofos de la ciencia hoy que crean eso. Me parece que es una posición abandonada hace muchísimo tiempo, porque los métodos de las distintas disciplinas varían. Entonces, pedirle a la historia que tenga el mismo método de la física es una cosa absurda, ¿no? De la misma manera como sería absurdo pedirle a la física que tenga el mismo método que la historia. Bueno, eso lo podemos conversar después con unos 5 whiskies encima. ¿Algún otro comentario? Tenemos por ahí.
Thank you all for the conference. Okay, I have a question. I want to read it. Considering the pervasive influence of big data on and AI in global knowledge systems, how can we address the colonial challenge of ensuing that Andean and Amazonian epistemologies are not only translated but are truly understood and respected within these technologically driven frameworks? What specific methodological and ethical approaches must be developed to prevent the reduction of these rich epistemologies to mere data points in Western-centric systems?
Sure.
Would you like to answer?
Thank you for that question. It's an incredibly important question. I don't have any specific answers, but what I can say is that I do have colleagues at UCLA that are working on this, and including, there are indigenous data scientists, I guess you would call them, who are, the thing that I think is relevant is what the kind of perspective that I was pointing to at the end of my talk about data sovereignty, indigenous data sovereignty, how indigenous communities have treated data and other things that are coming from them differently, right? And this is a simplistic distinction, but I would say that the value system of ChatGPT Google and so on, is specifically something that indigenous scholars and indigenous adjacent scholars have argued against. You see this particularly in scholarship about language, where, so there are some linguists who would say languages are the property of all humankind, right? And so, and what that would mean is, we need to collect, we need to gobble up all the linguistic data in the world. This attitude you see among some linguists with regard to so-called disappearing languages, right? We need to hurry up and record all this information so that we know about it before it disappears. In the same way that you want to, an analogy has been made to collecting the last specimen of an insect before it disappears for the sake of biological knowledge, because if we don't collect that, it'll be gone forever. I mean, first of all, it's the wrong analogy for a variety of reasons, but second of all, it's something that indigenous communities have said, distinctly refused. Some of them have said, no, you cannot have our language. You cannot extract it and consume it for your project of, knowing everything that humans have ever known. And so I think that, and that's an important perspective, right? That one that's a point of view that should be heard, and it makes some people very upset. That in linguistics, that makes some people very upset for understandable reasons. If they have the value that we got to hurry up and find out about this strange language with the strange grammar, from the perspective of somebody before it goes away, so that we know that that kind of language is possible. Members of the community say, no, it's ours, and you can't have it, and we're going to die. And and then it's gone because it's part of us. And part of the argument has to do with, that I've heard, it has to do with, this knowledge of our language. It's part of us once we're gone. It is not really knowledge anymore in the sense of, the sense that I was talking about in my talk, right? It's no longer relevant because it lives inside of people. When the people are gone, it doesn't have any meaning anymore, right? That is not intelligible to certain kinds of people, but I think in the big data world, this could be important, right? Because you do see this logic that says, everyone's face must be processed by some kind of computer in order for us to improve face recognition algorithms. And we know that there are, in Europe, for example, there's laws that say, no, I refuse to have my face digested by your algorithm. So it's not just an indigenous perspective, right? But I think that kind of perspective, as much as it might disturb some people, needs to be heard and needs to be a possibility on the table. Because the other kind of point of view that I've heard in discussions about this, for example, at UCLA about data sovereignty and so on, is, and this is also a plausible perspective from my point of view. Well, somebody from other, people from other communities need to be in the discussion, right? So there's an anthropologist who recently visited my department, who is a linguistic anthropologist studying varieties of Black English in the United States. So different dialects and ways people talk, where if you looked at the speech-to-text algorithms that Google is using, Black people talking certain kinds of ways of talking, it doesn't capture them, right? They want to hire this person to fix the algorithm. And that's, to say, you have expertise about this dialect, we will pay you to make sure that dialect is included in this massive digestion of all the world's knowledge, right? And maybe that person might want to say, okay, I will do that, right? I will include these data in your universal project. But you can also see a point of view that says, no, maybe it's better that these algorithms aren't able to recognize these other dialects. It entirely depends, and I think that there's a variety of legitimate opinions here, but I just think this is a really good case which you're asking, where we need to have people that have different perspectives argue it out and have those perspectives on the table, because they are kind of missing. And that position of refusal that I'm talking about, like linguistic refusal that anthropologists know about pretty well, I think people in Google would be astonished to hear that there's such a thing as somebody saying, no, I just in principle refuse to have you know these things, because their value system, it says this is just universal human knowledge that we need to know about. So thank you for the question, but that's where I think I don't know the answer, but having other perspectives and other value systems in the room is going to be crucial for.
Or maybe because we just started to collect this kind of information. We don't know what's happening in the future.
That's right.
GPT-5, I don't know, GPT-6.
That's right, because you know there is this lack of knowledge of what's going to happen, and many people in the computer science community are talking about so-called existential risk. This could end up being the end of humanity. Who wants to have their data contribute to the end of humanity? I mean, there's a very reasonable position to say no, right? Even coming from within the value system of people in that community. So, you know, these discussions, this is a really good place where people coming from different views about what knowledge is. Could really be useful. Thank you.
Bueno, creo que tendríamos tiempo para una última pregunta breve. No sé si alguien tiene algo que añadir. Entonces, si no es así, una última pregunta.
Gracias. Buenas noches. En un contexto, bueno, en el que el proyecto se ha desarrollado en medio de la interculturalidad y la interdisciplinaridad, a la cual saludo y felicito, ¿no? Me gustaría saber si el proyecto de Project ha considerado la movilidad que hay en las poblaciones andinas y amazónicas. Por ejemplo, aquí en el Perú las poblaciones que están en la costa suelen moverse muy poco, no necesariamente migrando, sino moverse a lo largo del país para conocer y dejar su impronta en otras realidades. Pero las poblaciones andinas y más aún las poblaciones amazónicas sí suelen establecer un tránsito significativo, ¿no? Y con eso cruzar pues epistemologías, formas de conocimiento y de validez y de interpretación, ¿no es cierto? Entonces me gustaría saber si that project has considered that and how is important in your work. Thank you.
Creo que yo puedo contestar eso porque es parte del trabajo del equipo peruano, ¿no? Precisamente intentamos trabajar con grupos humanos que en la medida de lo posible tuvieran la mínima influencia del español o de la cultura occidental. Es prácticamente imposible encontrar eso en el caso del quechua, ¿no? Pero de todas maneras trabajamos con una comunidad de andahuaylas, no del Cusco, por ejemplo, que es una zona mucho más cosmopolita. En el caso de Shipibo también lo hicimos en Pucallpa, pero lo más interesante fue lo del Urarina, ¿no? Porque el Urarina, para empezar, es una lengua aislada, es una lengua que no tiene parientes, ¿no? O sus parientes se extinguieron ya, y es una lengua que pertenece a una comunidad relativamente hace poco contactada. Entonces, por supuesto que hemos tomado en consideración el hecho de la movilidad, de las relaciones que hay entre las distintas comunidades, pero hemos tratado en lo posible de estudiar las comunidades que tuvieran menos influencia del mundo occidental, ¿no? Pues entonces creo que nos quedamos acá. Yo simplemente quisiera agradecer una vez más a nuestros tres invitados, a Beli Mitova, que ha venido desde Sudáfrica, no sé cuántas horas ha volado, pero montones, a Clark Barrett, un extraordinario amigo nuestro, que es tercera vez, si no me equivoco, que viene a Lima, y espero que no sea la última, y Edward Machery es una de las personas más importantes en el proyecto, que también es segunda vez que viene a Lima. Así que yo quisiera pedir un aplauso para ellos y para ustedes por su generosa presencia.